Welcome to Fairfax Files. There's many people out there right now in the media and observers that feel that Bryan Kohberger is innocent. And that's due to a combination of legal principles, defense strategies, and perceived weaknesses in the prosecution's case. Let's go through reasons why people would feel that he is innocent or guilty, and then we will break down each of those points. Let's look at point number 1. Presumption of innocence. In the U.S. legal system, every defendant is presumed innocent until proven guilty. Kohberger's defense and family have emphasized this principle, urging the public to withhold judgment until all evidence is presented in court. 2. Disputed evidence. The defense has challenged several pieces of evidence. DNA evidence. A knife sheath with Kohberger's DNA was found at the crime scene. The defense argues that the method used to obtain this DNA, known as investigative genetic genealogy, IgG, was unconstitutional and that the DNA could have been planted. Eyewitness testimony. A surviving roommate described seeing a masked man with bushy eyebrows. The defense contends this description is too vague to conclusively identify Kohberger. Amazon purchase records. Prosecutors allege Kohberger bought a knife matching the murder weapon. The defense seeks to exclude this evidence, questioning its relevance and accuracy. 3. Alibi claims. Kohberger's attorneys assert he was driving alone and stargazing during the time of the murders. They plan to present cell phone data to support this alibi, although the prosecution argues that the defense has not provided sufficient evidence to substantiate this claim. 4. Concerns about law enforcement conduct. The defense alleges that the law enforcement officers violated Kohberger's constitutional rights during his arrest and the collection of evidence. They claim that search warrants weren't obtained based on misleading information and that Kohberger was not properly advised of his rights at the time of his arrest. 5. Public support and advocacy. Several online communities and social media groups have emerged advocating for Kohberger's innocence and emphasizing the importance of due process. These groups argue that the media coverage has been biased and that the public should await the trial's outcome before forming opinions. 6. Defense's confidence. Kohberger's legal team has expressed strong confidence in his innocence, stating their belief that the evidence will ultimately exonerate him. They also highlighted the lack of a clear motive and the absence of a direct connection between Kohberger and the victims. The trial is scheduled to begin on August 11th, 2025 in Boise, Idaho, following a change of venue due to concerns about pre-trial publicity. The proceedings are expected to last approximately 3 months. Now let's talk about the presumption of innocence, because it is a foundational principle of the justice system, especially in the US and many other democracies. It means that anyone accused of a crime is legally considered innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Here's how it plays out in the Bryan Kohberger case. Legal protection. Kohberger, like all defendants, has the right to a fair trial, which includes not being treated as guilty until the prosecution proves it beyond a reasonable doubt. The burden of proof lies entirely on the prosecution. The defense doesn't have to prove innocence. They only have to raise reasonable doubt about the charges. Public opinion versus legal reality. The high-profile nature of the Idaho case has caused intense media coverage and speculation. While many in the public may feel convinced of his guilt based on leaked details or headlines, the court must remain neutral and evidence-based. Bryan's attorneys and some supporters remind people not to let emotions or media bias override the principle of fairness and objectivity. Some emphasize this very strongly because Kohberger hasn't had a trial yet. People who support the legal process, even those unsure of his guilt, stress this presumption to protect his right to a fair trial. Some also worry that the media portrayal could taint a jury pool or influence the public, which is why his trial venue has been moved from Moscow, Idaho to Boise. Even if the evidence feels convincing, he is legally innocent until proven guilty. This principle protects everyone's rights, not just Kohberger's. Now let's break down point 2. Disputed evidence. One of the biggest reasons some people question Bryan Kohberger's guilt is it revolves around how solid, relevant, or even legally obtained the evidence is. His defense team is strategically trying to get key pieces of the prosecution's case thrown out or weakened. Here's a breakdown. DNA evidence on the knife sheath. Investigators found a knife sheath near one of the victims, and on the snap button was DNA matching Kohberger. However, the defense challenges this DNA and how it was obtained. Investigators used investigative genetic genealogy, IgG, to find a family match through public DNA databases, like the ones people use for ancestry tests. Kohberger's team argues that this method may have violated his rights because it wasn't fully disclosed or sanctioned by a court order at the start. They're also questioning chain of custody, suggesting the DNA could have been planted or transferred unintentionally. Eyewitness account. One of the surviving witnesses told police she saw a masked man with bushy eyebrows the night of the murders. The defense claims this is too vague and too general to point to Kohberger. They emphasize she didn't report any other identifying features and waited hours before calling for help. Some believe this account alone isn't strong enough to implicate him, especially since bushy eyebrows isn't exactly rare. Cell phone and surveillance data. Kohberger's cell phone was reportedly turned off during the time of the killings, which prosecutors argue was a way to evade tracking. But the defense counters that just because someone turns off a cell phone doesn't prove they are committing a murder. People often do that for privacy or sleep. They also question the accuracy and interpretation of surveillance footage that allegedly shows his car driving near the crime scene. Amazon purchase history. Authorities say he bought a knife that is the style similar to the one believed to be used in the crime. The defense wants to exclude this evidence, arguing that many people own such knives, and that purchasing one months earlier doesn't prove it was the murder weapon. Fiber and vehicle evidence. Fibers found at the crime scene allegedly match those from Kohberger's car or apartment. His team says there is no direct proof that the fibers were found from his personal belongings or that they weren't transferred by accident. The defense is creating doubt about how the evidence was collected, whether it's circumstantial, and how reliable it is. Supporters who believe he's innocent often point to these gaps in legal questions as reasons to pause and wait for trial. Kohberger's claimed alibi is he says he was driving alone and stargazing the night of the murders, early morning hours of November 13, 2022, which would place him away from the crime scene in Moscow, Idaho. Details of the alibi. According to court filings, Kohberger was not at the house where the 4 University of Idaho students were killed. His lawyers say he often drove at night alone, especially to observe the stars, which aligns with his background in criminology and interest in psychology and introspection. They're using this habit to argue that he wasn't acting suspiciously, but just following his routine. Cell phone data as support. The defense has said they'll use cell tower and location data to support his alibi. Kohberger's phone was reportedly turned off for about 2 hours, which prosecutors argue is suspicious. But the defense says this does not prove guilt, and they plan to show data from before and after that window to help verify his movements. Some people believe the alibi. Supporters who believe in his innocence say the lack of physical evidence like blood, footprints, or confirmed eyewitnesses in the house undermines the case. His behavior afterward, going back to school, applying for internships, acting calm, doesn't match what they'd expect from someone who committed such a brutal crime. The alibi, if supported by data, may cast enough doubt to make conviction harder. This is why the alibi is controversial. The timing is key. The murders are believed to have occurred between 4 a.m. and 4:25 a.m. If the defense can't prove exactly where he was during that time, the alibi might fall apart. Also, driving alone means there are no witnesses to verify his story. It all comes down to digital evidence. Strategy of the defense. They're not saying, here's proof. He was elsewhere at 4 a.m. They're saying, you can't prove he was there. Legally, this can work if they can create reasonable doubt, especially by questioning timeline, data interpretation, and motive. Let's explore reason 4, media bias and presumption of guilt, which plays a huge role in why some people believe Bryan Kohberger might be innocent, or at least not judged fairly yet. Media's influence on public perception. From the moment Kohberger was arrested, the media painted a sensational portrait. He was called things like creepy, cold, calculating, and obsessed with criminology. Reporters quickly dug up his Reddit posts from years ago about criminal psychology and used them to build a narrative of guilt even before any trial began. Photos of him looking emotionless in court or staring at women were circulated and scrutinized, shaping public opinion. This intense nonstop coverage led some people to say he's already been tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. True crime and culture assumptions. We're living in an era where true crime stories are consumed like entertainment, podcasts, YouTube breakdowns, TikToks, documentaries. In this environment, people often assume guilt first, especially when a case is horrifying. Kohberger, being a criminology PhD student, fit the perfect true crime villain mold, making it easy for audiences to latch onto that image without questioning the deeper facts. Lack of balanced coverage. Many who defend Kohberger or believe he may be innocent point out defense arguments get little airtime, while prosecution theories get major headlines. News outlets rarely emphasize the presumed innocent aspect of the case. When evidence is disputed or weak, it's reported with far less intensity than damning or dramatic claims. Jury influence. Because this media saturation, Kohberger's defense team requested a change of venue for his trial, arguing too many people in the local area have already formed strong opinions. A fair trial may be impossible if jurors have an unconscious bias due to what they've seen in the media. That motion was granted. The trial was moved to Ada County, Boise, Idaho, hundreds of miles away. Summary? In short, some believe Kohberger could be innocent, or at least not proven guilty yet, because the media's portrayal may have unfairly influenced the public, shaping a narrative before facts were tested in court. This leads to an important question. Is it ever possible for someone like Kohberger to get a truly fair trial when the world is already watching, judging, and deciding guilt alone? Let's talk about 5. Lack of clear motive. One of the biggest questions in this case is, why would Bryan Kohberger kill 4 college students he seemingly didn't know? And this is the prosecution's challenge. So far, no concrete motive has been publicly proven. Prosecutors haven't presented a clear link or personal connection between Kohberger and the victims. There's no evidence of jealousy, romantic involvement, financial benefit, or revenge. Defense's argument. His lawyers use the absence of a motive as a reasonable doubt argument. They say a person doesn't just wake up one day and plan a quadruple murder without a compelling reason, especially someone with no known history of violence. Why this matters. Jurors often want to understand the why behind a crime. Without a motive, it's harder to create a narrative that feels convincing, which could weaken the prosecution's case. Counterpoint. Some argue that motive isn't legally required for conviction, just the proof of action that he did it. But still, a lack of motive can tip the scales toward doubt, especially in cases based on circumstantial evidence. 6. Personality and behavior. Supporters often cite Kohberger's background, demeanor, and habits as inconsistent with a brutal killer. Academic and professional profile. Kohberger was a PhD student in criminology at Washington State University. He was described by some professors as highly intelligent, engaged, and academically curious. His study focus was on understanding criminal minds, not acting like one. No criminal record. Kohberger had no violent criminal history, no history of stalking, assault, or mental breakdowns. He passed background checks for his academic programs and reportedly had no behavioral red flags. Behavior after the murders. After the killings, Kohberger reportedly acted calm and normal, continued his classes, graded student papers, drove cross-country with his father for winter break. Supporters say this doesn't match the psychological profile of someone who had just committed such a horrific act. Other people's impressions. Some classmates said he was socially awkward, but not aggressive. A few said he could be arrogant or difficult to talk to, but not threatening. These mixed descriptions leave room for interpretation, especially without solid evidence of violent tendencies. 5 and 6 form this argument. If there's no clear motive and no violent past, is it reasonable to believe that Kohberger suddenly became capable of one of the most gruesome crimes in recent American history? That doubt is what some people are holding on to. Not to say he's definitely innocent, but that the case isn't clear-cut enough for a conviction without thorough scrutiny. Questions about DNA evidence is one of the most hotly debated parts of the case and a core issue for those who question Kohberger's guilt. You see, the main DNA link, the knife sheath, the only physical DNA that ties Bryan Kohberger to the crime scene, was found on a knife sheath. This sheath was left at the crime scene under the body of victim Madison Mogen. Authorities say a single male DNA sample was recovered from the button snap of the sheath. This DNA is not a direct match, but a familial match. They used genetic genealogy and then later confirmed a match from Kohberger's trash and his swab afterwards. This is leaving people skeptical. The sheath is the only item with the DNA. In a brutal stabbing of 4 people, many expected more biological evidence like blood, hair, or skin cells from the perpetrator. Yet none of Kohberger's DNA has been found on the victims, their clothing, beds, or in other areas of the house. The DNA match was through genealogy. Critics argue that the genetic genealogy is not infallible, and some believe it's vulnerable to misidentification or human error. It involves comparing DNA to relatives who may have uploaded their info to public ancestry databases, not a direct one-to-one match like the CODIS. Contamination theories. Some people question if the sheath could have been planted or contaminated, especially since Kohberger was studying criminology and might know how to mislead an investigation. However, no hard proof supports this. It's more of a suspicion than a proven flaw in the case. Kohberger's defense team is expected to heavily challenge the DNA evidence at trial. They might argue that a single touch DNA point is not enough to convict someone of quadruple murder. They could bring in an expert witness to dispute the validity of the genealogical tracing method. The chain of custody, how the sheath was handled and tested, could also be contaminated for possible mistakes or procedural flaws. Why it still matters so much? Even though it's just one piece of DNA, prosecutors view it as a key link because the sheath was left right next to a victim. It matches the type of knife likely used in the murders that Kohberger had purchased on Amazon. The recovered DNA traces back to Kohberger's family, then to him directly. But for some, it's too thin a thread to justify the weight of the entire case, especially when there's no video, no witnesses, no other physical trace of him in the house. In our next video, we will cover how genetic genealogy works, and we will break down how the defense might cross-examine the DNA at trial. Thank you so much for joining Fairfax Files. See you next week.